Early October 1982, Logan, the typically quiet county seat of Ohio's Hocking Hills, is shocked by a pair of frightful murders and dismemberments. What follows is a twisting story involving lovers, villains, botched investigations, witchcraft, drugs, a wrongful conviction, and the community's loss of life and innocence. This is Township Falls.
In the last episode, we covered the murder trial of Dale Johnston, who was found guilty by a 3-judge panel after waiving his right to a jury trial. Dale was sentenced to die by the electric chair on the 2-year anniversary of the death of his stepdaughter Annette Cooper and her fiancé Todd Schultz. Hi, I'm Sarah, and I'm joined today by my co-host and husband Adam. I wanted to take a minute and thank you for subscribing to the Township Falls podcast. And I would like to ask you to take a minute and leave us a positive review. We appreciate that you have been sharing the podcast with your true crime and history-loving friends. If you want to see photos to go along with this story, hop over to Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok.
Chapter 5, Township Falls. In the years preceding the trial, Logan would try to move on. It was announced for the safety of the county's youngsters that trick-or-treat would be held in the daylight hours. In an attempt to offset the disappointment collectively felt by us kids of the town, Mayor Evan Hand Jr. reestablished the Halloween parade. The event would be under the close observation of patrolling policemen, both uniformed and plain-clothed. Children were encouraged to don their costumes and march with a parent down Main Street. This would be followed by a costume contest, judged by local officials. My mom, a very positive person, saw this as an opportunity to part the gloomy clouds and went all in with her planning. She announced that this year we would make my costume together. Looking back, I'm convinced that she was only looking for a way to insert her favorite film into a dark holiday. As a result, my Wizard of Oz scarecrow won under the category of most creative. When it came time for the parade the following year, my mom had to work. Thinking it'd be cool to make another costume, I asked my dad, who had the weekends off from his job at Carborundum, to assist me. Up for the challenge to one-up my mom, he rummaged through in his shed and he produced a broken-down cardboard box, as well as a utility knife, and to my utter confusion, our holiday ornaments. Dad set me up to fail that year, where I stepped on the main street dressed as a Christmas tree, complete with lights, tinsel, and ornaments. My proud dad was sure this would top Mom's scarecrow from the year before. Kids I knew parted the way for me as I stood on Main Street awaiting the start of the parade. My friend Heath and his brother Ryan approached, and I could tell from the grins on their face that this was going to be a rough march. "Why are you a Christmas tree, dude? It's Halloween." "Yeah, you look like a dork." And so it went. The Logan Chieftain band got us moving. Even though my peripheral vision was obscured by a drooping star and a cluster of tinsels, I was aware that the ornery kids were pulling off pieces of my tree costume with each progressive block we'd march. Furthermore, it was difficult to determine the culprit as literally everyone was either laughing or smirking at me. I jingled all the way. Needless to say, I didn't win under any category that year, though had most sparse been an option, I would have won the blue ribbon, for by the time I reached the judge's platform, I resembled Charlie Brown's tree, with just a single ornament remaining.
Sometimes when you live in a small town like Logan, you forget that there is a big world out there beyond the safe borders of your community. After Dale Johnston was arrested and sentenced to death, Logan could finally say goodbye to the outsiders, the reporters, the lawyers, the experts, and the judges. The town was generally happy to put this behind them. The current mayor expressed concerns that Logan would be tarnished by this grisly crime. The Hocking Hills wasn't such a big to-do with the tourists back then, but it's safe to say this cloud hung over the town for a while. I can recall being a kid and hearing things like, "Oh, they'll let you get away with murder in Hocking County."
A Mandela effect like urban myths sprouted up around this time. It concerns a comment that Johnny Carson never said. However, if asked, many to the date will swear that Carson mentioned the 1982 murders once in his monologue, stating, "If you want to get away with murder, go to the Hocking Hills." Many remember Johnny saying those immortal words with one exception, and it's always with their own geography and tragedy involved. If you want to get away with murder, go to Clinton, Iowa. If you want to get away with murder, go to Crossville, Tennessee, and so on. One variation of the effect has the line said by Paul Harvey. Here's the thing, it never happened. Sorry to disappoint you if you're one of the many who recall him saying it. Myth Urban 101 has a fun blog dedicated to the many people who report on one or both of the men saying it in regards to their own home.
The arrest, prosecution, and sentenced imposed was satisfactory in Logan. Really, everyone was ready for this to be over, finished with. One article from 1984 has a quote from a Logan resident, Jean Ellis, who said, "I am relieved that I no longer have to live in fear. It's been hell for me because I live alone. I used to sleep with a butcher knife right by my side, and I kept my hand right on it." The same article states that a crowd of 200 had gathered earlier and chanted, "Hang him! Hang him!" and that Don Schultz was seen wearing a t-shirt that read, "Hang the bastard," after Dale was sentenced to death. A few weeks later, when interviewed, Sandra Schultz spoke of the void and the pain of losing her son while clutching a photo of him. She remarked that they should let Sarah sit in Dale's lap when they fry him. Don Schultz declared that the bitterness would always be there. Look at what he did to this community. Look at what he did to this family. There's no denying that the loss of Todd and Annette had impacted their family. Don was angry and outraged, and I dare say a little hot-headed in all of his interviews about this subject. Sandra was not as outrageously angry, but she surely had her share of pain and suffering to contend with. While these things were being said about the Johnston family by the Schultz family, Sarah was quoted in a newspaper in October of 1984 saying, "I feel sorry for Sandy. She lost the boy she loved very much. But she acts as if she lost 2 kids and I didn't lose anybody." In fact, Don was so upset and outraged and in not a good place mentally that it was reported Mr. Schultz appeared at the Johnston farm on July 9, 1983, almost 3 months before Johnston was indicted, on September 29, 1983. Sarah Johnston hailed a passing sheriff's car and reported the incident. Deputies stopped Mr. Schultz's car minutes later and found he was armed. Hocking County Municipal Court records show deputies charged Mr. Schultz on July 13, 1983, with improper handling of a firearm in a motor vehicle, a misdemeanor. Deputies claim that Mr. Schultz had a loaded H&R .32 caliber revolver. The charges were dismissed on January 13, 1984, 2 days after Mr. Johnston's trial began, records show.
As sentencing was completed, Dale's attorney left the small city of Logan. They were escorted out of the county and they were threatened by residents in Logan as they walked away from the courthouse. Dale was housed at Lucasville Correctional Facility first. In this maximum security prison, a nearby wing held old Sparky. The electric chair sat waiting for Dale as it had since its last use in 1962. Sarah would visit 2 times a month. She said sometimes they would speak of Annette and cry, but she tried to keep the mood light during her visits. Dale starts telling the media that the police in Logan had twisted the case in January of 1984. By this time, the elated laughter for the Schultz family had faded to tears. Not even death row conviction could bring back their son. This was maybe the first time they had been able to stop and face this new reality. In April of 1984, Dale Johnston's attorney requests for an execution delay. This was granted.
In early May of 1984, Dale Johnston tested positive for tuberculosis. The law enforcement officers that had been in contact with Dale had to undergo skin tests to determine if they too had contracted TB. You can almost hear their rumbles in the background saying, "That dirty son of a bitch." While the test isn't painful, it sure would poke at a sore spot with all involved. It was reported a few days later that Dale tested negative for TB. After this, Dale was housed in his own cell due to his medical reasons for a short time. You might have the same misconception that I did. I thought death row inmates were locked away all by themselves for the rest of their lives. Not so. In some cases, they can be housed with about 20 men in a cell. Dale's troubles didn't only extend to him. His stepbrother was brought in on some sex charges in May of '84 in a nearby city. It was reported in the news, police placed sex charges on stepbrother of Dale Johnston. I have opted to leave his name out of this podcast because 1. It's not really relevant to the case. And 2, this person is dead. 3, I'm not researching that and only mention it because I did run across it during the hundreds of hours I've spent researching old newspapers in reference to this case. My uncle, who was in the Hocking County Sheriff's Department, always suspected Dale had been responsible, but had help from his stepbrother. Now I understand why he had that idea, because of those charges. In July of 1984, Dale Johnston claimed that death row was unjust. This article was published in the Columbus Dispatch. The residents of Logan were amused by this statement. They would have agreed it was absolutely unjust to house this man on death row. That switch should have been flipped already. I have no doubt that if Hocking County had made a motion to bring back public hangings, Dale would have been the first. In July of '84, Dale's attorney had thought of a few new witnesses and filed a motion for a new trial, which was rejected under the basis that these things could have been brought up in the trial originally. They were not newly discovered. The panel of judges also rejected the argument that the prosecution withheld evidence.
In August of '84, police were able to search the vehicle of Kevin Tex Meyer, who had finally come on the radar as a viable suspect. This was nearly 2 years after the murders. Dale's attorney believed in him and his innocence, so they got a special investigator, a man in Hocking County, Bud Walker, to start looking around. Walker was dumbfounded that the police had never come to the conclusion that he had. Those kids encountered someone on the train tracks who shot and dismembered them. Walker's job had to have been hard. How could you prove Dale didn't do it and someone else did, when Dale was all anyone really wanted to talk about? The police were disinterested in the victims, as everyone else seemed to be too. The second Todd and Annette died, they exited their story. Their lives became irrelevant. Walker had to dig to break past that. In fact, even during the trial, it was never really about Todd and Annette. It was about all those things that made Dale an odd bird in Logan. But Walker asked questions, he listened, he made notes, and he found just enough to raise eyebrows, but not enough to prove Dale was innocent.
Walker paid 2 Logan residents to distribute handbills asking for information on the crimes, offering a reward and giving some basic info about Todd and Annette and their habits. This handbill included a toll-free number that residents could call and leave tips, what I wouldn't give to listen to the calls that came in. Steve Mowry told Special Investigator Walker about Annette's well-known promiscuity before her death. She was said to have been found locked in a police car having relations with an officer in the back seat. Videotapes surfaced of Annette having sex with local men. Photos of naked Annette having sex with a local man in the back of a truck surfaced. While apparently this was a known thing, as was Dale's supposed involvement with her, somehow this didn't seem to be worthy of investigation at the time. For all the people in Logan who knew of Annette's supposed troubled home life, no one acted. For all of the people who knew of Annette's active sex life, not an eyebrow was raised that this could have been a factor in the death of the young couple. In fact, in the interviews I have conducted for this podcast 39 years after her death, I've had several people ready to tell me that Annette was promiscuous, but only because of what her parents had done to her within their weird, remote home place. Even after the truth has come out, people are unable or maybe unwilling to relent in their suspicions about the Johnston situation.
Let's talk about this. Several people have been quoted in the news from 1982 to 1990 stating that their disbelief at the accusations and the verdict against Dale. Neighbors of the Johnston family were shocked by the verdict. They reported Dale to be a mild-mannered man. Dale's stepfather was shocked at the verdict. He was always considered Dale to be a good kid and never one to cause trouble.
A young lady who refused to be named claimed to have known Dale and Annette, and she said that if Dale had a violent side, he hid it well. She also said that she had dated Todd the year before he died and even attended the prom with him in 1981. She said if anyone had a temper, it was Todd. He had a short fuse. In her newspaper article, she describes Todd to sound a little bit like his father Don in attitude. Michelle Cooper has given very few interviews over the last 40 years. I tried to contact her and wasn't surprised to not get a response. But she was quoted as saying that Fred Mong would get close to her and just stare. Along with Thompson interrogating her all of the time, she says she felt like a prisoner. They even tried to hypnotize her a few times to help her memories. She went on to say that her biological father refused to take her in even for a few days during this difficult time. But when the interviewer asked her if she would rather have been with her biological dad or Dale, she said she would have lived with Dale, no questions about it. She loved Dale. He was a good father to her.
When people asked Michelle about these accusations, she would say, "No, Dad wouldn't do that. This is something to keep in mind. These two girls loved Dale. They didn't go around calling him stepdaddy or Dale or Mr. Johnson. He was dad to them." After Dale was sentenced, Sarah went to Columbus to stay with Dale's mother for a while, but ultimately returned to the trailer on Trowbridge Road as she really had nowhere else to go. Sarah and Dale no longer owned the trailer. It had been signed over to the attorneys for representing Dale. They were kind enough to allow Sarah to stay on the property she had called home for nearly a decade as she found her footing. As Sarah returned to her life at the trailer, she was alone. Annette was gone, and she had never had a chance to mourn for her daughter. Michelle was still in foster care, where she would stay until she aged out of the system. Dale was locked up. Sarah may have been as alone as she had ever been, and certainly in the worst shape of her life, but she could count on one person to be a constant presence in her life, Detective Jim Thompson.
One night, as she sat alone in her remote trailer that had once been so full of life with her family around, those were lives they were happy to live, no matter how odd they seemed to some, Sarah heard some noises. She grabbed her shotgun and went out to her porch, and it was a familiar face. Jim Thompson again. Sarah shouted at him, "What are you doing?" He replied that he's out there on police business. Sarah asked to see the warrant. He assures her that he doesn't need one. Sarah had just about had enough at this point. Sarah had been unable to find and hold on to work. People in the area knew who she was, and they all believed that she had been involved in murdering and dismembering the teens. People whispered about her in town. It was threatened that she would be charged for her role in all of this. The few friends and supporters that tried to be there for Sarah were questioned and hassled. People called and harassed her over the phone. Sarah did land a job in retail, but her boss had to let her go as he was being pressured by some folks in town. They promised to boycott the business and see it closed if that woman kept working there. So at that moment, everything probably felt pretty heavy on Sarah's shoulders. Sarah just reacted, and she fired off a shot in his direction. While she isn't sure if she hit him, and it was only birdshot, it was rumored that when Thompson took a flight out of town the next day, he was very uncomfortable in his seat for the long trip to California. Things kept spiraling for Sarah. Someone had set fire to the framework on the house that Dale was building before the teens had been murdered. It was a clear message that she wasn't welcome nor wanted in Logan. Without work and no way to feed the farm animals, Sarah had to sell some of them off. It caused her a great deal of pain to part with her dogs. As she literally had no one left in the world, I am certain those animals provided comfort and companionship for her, and then she had to get rid of them. She was able to keep Dale's favorite horse until it died at the age of 26. That gives me a little comfort to know Sarah wasn't all alone, as a horse can be a great friend. By 85, Sarah was in counseling, but it could only help so much. She had so much anger building that she began to hatch a plan. She was going to blow up a building that the people she suspected of killing her daughter would be at. If anyone survived, she would shoot them with her rifle. She says she wasn't really going to do this, but admits her mind went to some very dark places. As she told her counselor about this plan to illustrate her mental state, the counselor excused himself and reported this. Sarah was arrested by the Logan police within a short time from leaving her session. One of the men who had prosecuted her husband had moved on to become a judge by then. He personally signed the order for Sarah to be committed to a state mental hospital, where she received several months of treatment. When Sarah was released, fortunately, Michelle had aged out of the system and was able to help care for her mother. Sarah was encouraged to leave Hocking County if she wanted to stay sane, and she did that. She didn't have much choice. It is reported that the mobile home burned to the ground. No one can say if the fire was intentionally set or if it was an accident or maybe an electrical fire, but it is rather fishy that their home and the framework for the home they hope to have one day were both burned within such a short time. I have my theories about who set these fires, but no way to prove it. I would imagine if you have any deductive reasoning skills, you might have an idea of who would do such a thing as well. But I did notice that I couldn't find a single newspaper article or report about the mobile home fire, just mention of it within the Don Cannon book, and that is interesting that it was kept out of the news. I would think that not one, but 2 fires at the property of a convicted murderer would raise some eyebrows, but I guess not. It is at this point that I want to stop my storytelling and make a personal plea to you. Sarah, Annette's mother, has no photos of her daughter, no mementos or keepsakes, no artwork or school projects that her daughter would have brought home for her mother to display. Everything she had was lost in the fire. When we spoke last, she told me that she regretted she could not provide any photos of Annette for our podcast, and she explained why. I told her that any photos of Annette I could find, I would personally print and send to her. So if you knew Annette when she was growing up in Greene County, if you went to school with her at some point, or were a friend of hers as a teen, please reach out and send us a scan of your photos of Annette so that I could share them with her mother. You can message us on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, or email them to us at townshipfallspodcast@gmail.com. But back to our story.
By November of 1984, Dale's attorneys were really working for a retrial. Hocking County answered the appeal with a simple message: uphold the conviction. Rumors around town about Detective Thompson and his satanic pals continued to be whispered, but compared to the monster he had proven Dale to be, people seemed to be okay dealing with that eccentricity. It could be so much worse, as they had already seen. In 1985, Sarah Johnson was in the Greene County Bureau newspaper. She said, "He wants people to know he didn't do it. He wants to be vindicated. He'll never be satisfied until he finds out who killed this little girl." At the same time, the Schultz family was awaiting Dale Johnson's execution. Don was quoted in the same article as saying, "I like to be there when they fry him. I get a great amount of satisfaction knowing that the last thing he saw was my smiling face." By May of 1985, Dale's attorneys were filing more briefs in a motion for a new trial. This time, things pointed right at Jim Thompson and his involvement in the cults of the county. Detective Chief Dale Criffens of Tiffin, Ohio, was a nationally recognized expert on these matters. He had been called into Logan years before Todd and Annette were murdered. Back when Thompson had been demoted from chief to a detective, he left some colorful gifts for his new boss, including a voodoo doll. Had Griffins been called on to testify in the courtroom, he would have made it clear that he personally linked Thompson to the cults, and he would have shown that Thompson was a bit of an odd character and likely discredited his investigation. At some point during this time, the Columbus Dispatch slaps the city of Logan with the Freedom of Information Act to get a hold of Detective Jim Thompson's personnel files, to find out exactly why this officer, who had been demoted, had a special position created for him to stay on the force.
In newspaper clippings I found, the city claims his cult interests and activities had nothing to do with his demotion. The city claimed that Jim Thompson was lazy. He had a poor work ethic and spent too much time out of the office while he was on duty. He was too lazy to be in charge of the police department, but he was perfectly suited to head up a murder investigation. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Again, in September of '85, another appeal was filed to reverse the conviction against Dale. This time, the motions claimed that both the prosecution and law enforcement withheld evidence that would have proven Dale was not the one who killed the kids. The brief stated that the evidence presented was insufficient to warrant a guilty verdict. By August of '86, the Court of Appeals had overturned the verdict. From there, the case would go to the Ohio Supreme Court. You can almost imagine all of the groans and outrage the city of Logan would have displayed. As soon as they can fall asleep without a nightmare or a test for tuberculosis, Dale turns up like a bad penny, ready to open all of those old wounds again. It's like Johnson kept picking off the scab and making the boo-boo bleed again.
Steve Ryan is interviewed by a few area newspapers. He sticks to his guns. He knew what he saw. He saw Dale Johnson grab Annette and force her into a car. He also saw Dale shove Todd into the car too. Steve goes on to say that the media was unfair. They tried to make the man on the street a part of the jury. They made Logan look bad. Dale's attorneys were obviously swaying the media with their wild tales of cults and creepy Satanists. Ryan stated he heard 2 female reporters say to Tyak, one of Dale's attorneys, "Your cheerleaders are here," when they arrived at the courthouse for the trial. And ain't that some shit? These outsiders had opinions that weren't appreciated by anyone who mattered. Dale remained incarcerated. By this point, Sarah had filed for divorce. She had reached a low point. Dale would have rather kept Sarah as a friend than stayed married to her and let the stress of it all lead to her death. It was a lot of stress for Sarah. She was always under suspicion for something. She truly believed she would be charged with murdering her daughter.
After Sarah left Hocking County, she told a reporter she wouldn't drive through Hocking County alone. That was probably a smart move on her part. By '88, the courts had examined a lot of the evidence. It was decided that evidence had been withheld, Steve Ryan's testimony was recognized as being a mistake, and shouldn't have been allowed in court. The court also addressed the matter of hearsay. It is obvious that the accusations of sexual abuse were highly inflammatory and were in violation of the hearsay rule and should have never been allowed at the trial. The prosecution claimed the allegations of incest and abuse were valid because the allegations proved how fearful Annette was of Johnston. During this hearing, the court indicated that nearly every official involved in the investigation had provided hearsay evidence to the prosecution to build the case. It went without saying that Steve Ryan and the hearsay and the rumors were all they had. So what choice did they have but to allow all of this? Without it, Dale might not have been convicted.
The prosecution was found to be guilty of some misconduct. The court ruled that Steve Ryan's testimony shouldn't have been admissible. The court ruled that evidence had been withheld to the defense that would have helped Dale's case. Their verdict was that the decision had been reversed and that there would be a new trial. The current prosecutor of Hocking County appealed right away, but the court upheld the reversal. This news made the people in Logan uneasy about the new trial, with the testimony of the only eyewitness being ruled inadmissible. To say that people were not happy with this decision would be an understatement. But Gherkin made an announcement. He would try Dale Johnston for the murders again. This time, however, Dale would get a fair trial. His case would be heard in the state capital, Columbus, by a judge who wasn't tied into this small town life. Dale heard this news over the radio and was interviewed by a reporter. He said, "I am not convicted of anything now. I do not know why I have to have these handcuffs on." But Dale was transferred yet again, where he remained incarcerated. He was also held on bond on $200,000, which he could not afford to post. He had no money. He had mortgaged his property to help pay for his legal expenses. It was reported that Hocking County spent about $67,000 to try Dale for the double murders. Eventually, Dale was ordered to move to a county jail, but that was slow to happen. He was housed in a secret place for a time as he awaited his new trial. In 1989, Dale was finally moved to Columbus for his incarceration after threatening a hunger strike as he awaited his new trial. During this time, it was not that things were quiet in this case. Jailhouse informants came forward with tales of Dale's confessions of his crime.
But before the trial could get underway, the judge tossed out most of the evidence they did have. The boots and the boot print, as well as the testimony from supposed expert Robbins, were out. All evidence seized from the Johnston farm was tossed out. All of the testimony from Detective Thompson was out, as it was found that he had violated Dale Johnston's rights in his interrogations. Steve Ryan was out as a witness. Really, there wasn't much left to bring to trial. Basically, the real courts had found that some of the most basic parts of justice were violated for Dale during his time in the legal system. I'm sorry, it's hard to consider the Hocking County Courthouse as a real legal entity at this point in the story. They were playing by their own rules in those courtrooms. At some point, there is talk about moving Dale back to Hocking County for a new trial. Dale was adamant that he didn't want that to happen. He had reason to fear for his life in Hocking County. Dale's attorneys were prepared to do whatever they could to keep Dale out of the county. Luckily for all involved, Hocking County came out and said they didn't have room to house Johnston. I can't ever recall there being some big run on crime that would have taken up all the jail cells. I can recall being a kid and going into that very jail when I was maybe 11 years old to visit my Uncle Pee-wee, who had been arrested for some alcohol charges. They didn't have a run on prisoners. In fact, they treated my uncle as a trustee, and he had free run of the basement in the sheriff's department during his stays there. I told you several episodes back that my grandparents were friends with Jim Jones and that he was a pretty nice guy. He made sure my uncle was comfortable, and if I recall correctly, I think my uncle was smoking a joint when I got there to visit with him at the jail. But that's another story for another day.
Back to Dale. Dale was to be retried, but there was a great deal of things that were thrown out on the Johnston murder trial. It was to the point where they didn't have a whole lot of anything to use as evidence. Not even the vest and the boots taken from Dale would be allowed in this new trial. From the time of the ruling, Hocking County only had 90 days to bring Dale to trial again, to ensure he was granted his right to a speedy trial. This was all appealed, but the ruling to dismiss the evidence was upheld. At this point, there was only one thing that could be done, and with that, Dale was a free man, so to speak. 1 hour before Dale was scheduled to be released, a call came in promising that Dale would be shot to dead as soon as he walked out of the jailhouse. Dale was ushered out of the back way with his attorneys and law enforcement from Licking County, who weren't about to have any vigilante justice that day. To say people were upset would be an understatement. It was like they were just going to let this man walk free. The people truly believed that Dale had not only abused his bright, beautiful, and bubbly beauty queen stepdaughter, but that he had also viciously killed her and her lover. The people didn't understand how Dale was denied the basis of justice. They probably also had no knowledge of the court system and the many wrongs of this case. They certainly didn't understand hearsay rules, nor did the prosecution nor the judges that presided over the trial. In fact, Don Schultz had gone on to say that he was sorry he didn't kill Dale Johnston himself. Don said to Don Cannon, "That may not be what you wanted to hear, but that's the way I felt. Yeah." He went on to say that anytime Dale smiled with his attorneys during the trial, he was sure it was Dale saying, "Yeah, I killed your kid. There's nothing you can do about it." I really think he feels that way.
At the news conference, Dale celebrated his freedom. His ex-wife Sarah came to show her support for Dale, although she had remarried another man. Dale vowed to find the person who was responsible for the death of his stepdaughter Annette and her fiancé Todd Schultz. In the Hocking Hills, Don Schultz steamed. He declared he knows who did it. He did it. His ex-wife Sandra said they knew Dale killed the kids, and the 3 judges found him guilty of the crime. In other words, this was all bullshit. In the city of Logan, old fears had been renewed. In the Columbus Dispatch, a few local teenagers told reporters how their parents wouldn't let them out at night after the murders. But now that Dale Johnston was free, their parents wouldn't have to worry about it. They wouldn't go out alone. But one of the girls also mentioned that she wasn't convinced of Dale's guilt either.
Her friend getting a manicure, Miss Johnson stated that she was not related to Dale Johnston, but she thought that maybe he had done it, and if not, everyone knew he had sex with his stepdaughter. In South Perry, at the J&R grocery, Dale's release was a hot topic of conversation. Chris Schwabaugh recounted that most of these people who came in here tonight are against it. Schwabaugh said, "A lot of people can't believe he was given another trial. Everybody's been bitching. They didn't like the idea of giving him another trial because they all think he was guilty. I say he had something to do with it," Schwabaugh said.
When Dale was released in 1990, he had lost everything. His money, his land, his home, his wife, his stepdaughter. Dale had even lost his name, because for the rest of his days, people would look at him with suspicion, at least in Hocking County. He had the clothing on his back when he walked out into the world. Dale's attorney gave him some tools and an old truck. Dale set out to start his life over. He started taking on clients for handyman services, and he lived with his mother. In 1991, Dale wanted his appeal for justice to stay out of the Hocking County courthouse. He had legitimate reason to fear for his life there. Only 7 years before, when he was convicted of murder in Hocking County, there was fear that a lynch mob might come for him. You see, by this time, Dale tried to sue Hocking County for his 7 years of wrongful imprisonment after he was released. It had taken some time to get the case to court, and it was delayed once for the death of Dale's mother in 1992. Dale was unsuccessful, and his wrongful conviction suit would be heard in the very courthouse that he had been convicted of murder in years before.
Of course, Dale did not win this suit because he had the burden of proving he didn't murder Todd and Annette. Generally, a wrongful conviction suit would be supported by the confession or incarceration of another person in connection with the crime. Gherkin argued that for the 7 years Dale spent locked up, he was owed nothing by the county nor the state. As far as they knew, he had gotten away with the murder after only 7 years. No one else had been found guilty. While Dale was free in the sense of not being on death row, his reputation in Hocking County had been through the mud a time or two. In fact, in 1992, during a race for the office of prosecutor, Dale and his trial would become the main issue of the campaign. One of the 3 judges had come out of retirement and ran against Gherkin. Judge Stillwell had denied Dale several retrials in the past. He probably would have won, but Stillwell died before the election. The people of Logan weren't satisfied that Gherkin would continue to hold office. He had been pressed to bring Dale to the trial for the murders again by many within the community. He knew that the evidence and the witnesses that had been thrown out made for a very weak case. In the Osinski book, Guilty by Popular Demand, Gherkin was quoted saying that he was still ostracized over his handling of the Johnston case, and states it was a reason for his departure from public office. That was in 2011. Nearly 30 years after the crime occurred, he stated that he felt he tried Johnston again. The evidence would be ruled inadmissible, as if should have been, and Johnson would have been acquitted. Then should new evidence come forth, Dale would have been immune from the justice. Gherkin chalked it up as he did as best he could with what the previous prosecutor and the law enforcement officers had collected and left for him to work with. But some people would never forget how he had failed to secure justice for the city of Logan. Not for the 2 people who had lost their lives, because this story was never really about them, but for the city and their loss of innocence.
You might think with that, Dale Johnston is finally free to live his life and adapt to his new normal. I only wish that were the case. We are only at 1993 at this point in the story. Only 11 years have passed in this 40-year-old tragedy. Life went on in Logan, but people were unable and unwilling to forget about what had happened in that cornfield. We continued to host our trick-or-treating in the daylight hours, thank you very much. I can only recall going trick-or-treating at night one time in my childhood, when I went to Laurelville with my cousins Rose and Wanda Anderson. As the years passed, that area of the river and the cornfield where Todd and Annette were found had a bit of a blow-up. Logan would build a lovely park near the cornfield and river, not far from where the teens were so tragically killed. Mingo Park is a nod to the Mingo Indian chief John Logan, who had once lived in the area so many years before. When I was a child, I played softball there with my friends in the summer on the PG's team in our hot pink shirts. We were coached by my mother and her friend Pearl. What was once a small playground has grown into a sprawling wooden structure that half the town could practically play on together. There are ball fields, and I believe the youth city soccer leagues meet there too. At least they did when I was a kid. By that time, it was faux pas to walk across the train tracks and the trestle. The days of kids taking a shortcut to West Logan had all but passed. Only a few brave souls went around there. In a 1984 newspaper article, Mrs. Toops was quoted as saying, "Nobody goes down there no more. Some people say they should call it Death Bay." That sentiment seems to have stuck long after her words have faded from memory. Honestly, I don't think I even knew you could do that until I was probably 20 years old. My parents certainly wouldn't have given me any ideas, and chances are my friends were all in a similar situation. I wasn't as daring as my husband Adam, and I've only walked over the tracks into West Logan one time with Adam, back when we were just boyfriend and girlfriend many years ago. While doing so, we ran into my little brother Wimpy and had to ask him, "What are you doing back here?" with raised eyebrows. I do have one memory of screwing around by the river. This would have been around the summer of 1989. My softball league had tournaments, and we played several games a day over the course of several days. Most parents had agreed to contribute cold drinks and popsicles to keep the kids cool. And in between games, we were set free to roam. Being around 10 years old, I was obviously too cool for the playground. At least that was what I told my teammates when they sneered at the idea. We were free. Our mothers were all gossiping together, working on their tans at Mingo Park. So we crept back by the river. It was much cooler back there in the shade of the trees. The sound of the water immediately made things feel not so hot, especially on a day when the temperatures were in the mid-90s, as was pretty common of my childhood summers. My friends and I went around a slight bend back behind the first ball field, and as we stood there near the river, someone noticed a small, primitive wooden cross in the ground. It was 2 sticks tied together. I can recall standing beside my friend, the late Mindy Koffel, as we watched a few of the other girls screwing around, daring each other to pull the cross out of the ground. Mindy was sort of snarky and very funny as a kid, and we giggled and made jokes together. Finally, one girl pulled the cross from the ground, and a snake popped right out of the hole. Being a group of 9 to 11-year-old girls, we might have been too cool for the playground at the time, but we were not too cool to scream, shriek, and run like girls right out of there, around the fencing that designated the outfield, and right to our mothers. No one said a word about our riverbank adventures. I think we knew our moms weren't going to like that we were back there, where we might get our cute pink t-shirts dirtier than they already were from a hard-played ball game. I don't know, maybe they all knew what had happened back there in that cornfield, and knew better than to admit to going around there. Later that afternoon, my mom must have had enough of my antics, paired with the heat and the noise level of at least 10 preteen girls. So she dropped me off with my grandparents, where I was always happy to spend a night. I can remember standing in my grandma's kitchen. This is the place I dream of as an adult, home. I was telling her all about my adventures in the tournament, how many hits and runs I had made, how many popsicles I had already been given, which, naturally, I'd only had one. Mama was always good for popsicles, and I didn't want her to cut me off on such a hot day. I never watched what I said around my grandma. She thought the sun rose and set on my face. I was her sidekick for most of my life at that point, and I knew she could be rascally too. So I told her about the riverside adventure my team and I had. I spared her no details. I told her the jokes my friend Mindy and I had been making. I told her about being too old for the playground and how we set off for some shade and went back by the river behind that first field. I regaled her with the story about the crude cross and even the snake that popped out. We stood there, cracking her old ice cube trays, dumping the cubes into a Tupperware container and refilling them, and she was very sternly looking at me. She said, "Where the hell was your mother?" I was baffled, but honest, and I replied, talking gossip to the other moms. She said, "Don't you ever go back there again, young lady." She had never scolded me before in my entire life. I never knew the significance of that until Adam and I started talking about this case, and we determined it was pretty close to the cornfield area, and that's probably why my granny was so stern with me that day. But enough about me.
As far as the city of Logan and Hocking County went, people went back to their normal, maybe a little bit boring lives. Things changed as they're apt to do in most stories. Businesses came and went. The children who had been traumatized by the events in their sleepy little town started to grow up. Law enforcement officers left the force and new ones took their place. New officials were elected. People wanted to forget about what had happened. As far as they were concerned, Dale Johnson had gotten away with murder. The horror of the grisly double murders wasn't really talked about in the town too much. We all knew what happened, who did it, how he got away with it. It was one of those things that was just in the back of the mind, at least for me. Some considered it a mystery. Some considered it a misjustice. Some considered it one of those things that's just a dark spot in the past. Todd and Annette were spoken of less and less. Anytime the case was mentioned in Hocking County, the only thing you would hear was Dale Johnston. As the years passed, people died, moved on, grew up, grew old. From time to time, Dale would pop up on the news, but when he did, people in Logan were left with a bad taste in their mouth.
Lonnie Featheroff, who went on to become the prosecutor, said she wasn't sure if she could have proven Dale guilty in court had she tried the case, but she didn't criticize the work that her predecessors left for her. While she acknowledged she came into the story at the end, she was only a small child herself when all this happened in the 80s. On the subject of Dale's conviction, time on death row, and the denial of compensation, as a private individual and not an attorney, Featheroff said that she felt Dale deserved his time on death row for what people had reported about Dale and Annette's relationship. We sure have heard a lot of rumors about that. I really had to dig deep to find any source material that wasn't negative and based on rumors and allegations. But with some grit and a little help from some of the best people in the world, librarians, I did find some reports of people who weren't sold on these rumors. As I mentioned, my former elementary school teacher, Mrs. Sandra Starner, had been acquainted with Dale through 4-H, where he and Sarah helped and the kids were members. She doubted his involvement.
A man named Mr. Walton was skeptical from the beginning of the case, and speculated in town over coffee at places like the Gateway Family Restaurant on Main Street. How much physical evidence do they have that proves Johnson really did those murders? Another lady, Mrs. Seymour, who was affiliated with the Johnstons through the 4-H, said Dale took a real interest in his kids and that he was friendly but quiet and generally low-key. She felt that it was unfair that the town had so much speculation and had assumed his guilt, when no one in town really knew about the evidence they supposedly had against him. Clifton Sickles, who was retired, did not attend Johnson's trial, but based on what he read in the papers and saw on television, he said Johnson deserves a new trial. I don't think they really proved he did it, Johnson's stepfather Clarence Mezek of Mount Sterling, Ohio said. I never did think he did it. He never caused me a bit of trouble in any way. Just couldn't believe he could do anything like that. I still think he should have had a jury trial, and he should never have been tried down there to begin with.
You might think that after all this man had lost and the way things had gone for him, that he would become bitter and vengeful. Wouldn't it be something if I could tell you that Dale went off the deep end, or Dale did something horrible? Well, that wasn't the case. Dale lived a more positive life. At one point he said, "The way I see it, I have an obligation to my friends, my family, and the people of Hocking County to use every legal means possible to find out who killed Todd and Annette." Dale stated that, "My life has changed totally. I can't go home to Logan because that part of my life is over. So I'm drifting here, there. The people who believed in me before still believe in me, and that keeps me going." He goes on to say that he had a family whom he enjoyed riding horses with on the 53-acre property, which he considered to be the most beautiful, restful spot on earth for his semi-retirement. He will never get those things back.
But he didn't give up. Dale worked with his hands, creating a handyman business for himself near Columbus. He spoke to people about the case. He refreshed his memory, reading all he could about the case. Dale found comfort in the Lord. He maintained that he had faith that his God would not allow him to be executed for a crime he didn't commit. While Dale was incarcerated, he studied the Bible. He was well liked among his fellow death row inmates who would confine him. He joined a church where he met a lady and they fell in love and were married. They lived together until she died several years ago.
Dale has gone on to be a vocal advocate to end the death penalty. Dale considered himself to be a quiet and shy person, and now he will always have some sort of notoriety. At one point, he wanted to write a book about death row and how society needs to rethink this method of punishment. In some places, he is still a notorious killer, and maybe that is why I made this podcast. I think it is important to remember what really happened. Everyone in Logan and the surrounding area should have some type of knowledge on what did happen.
Pizza Crossing on Mulberry Street is Logan's neutral place to congregate. After a Logan Chieftains football game, it's hard to find a booth or a bar stool. PC sits catty-cornered to the old Shakers Theater building. Therefore, as people spilled out of the exits from their movies, they were assaulted with the wonderful smells of beer-doughed wafting. Wonderful marketing. The pizza truly is phenomenal, so much so that my brother-in-law, now a resident of Sacramento, California, insists on a pie from the beloved shop as soon as his plane lands. In the 80s, the back of Pizza Crossing had a bar as well as a few video games and pinball machines. It was the closest we had to an actual arcade, until Bradley's, later Nuts, would occupy a spot on East Main around the corner. With the games and the bar, this area was kept dark, unless someone opened the door to the rear parking lot, in which all the patrons, kids and adults, would give a grumpy exclamation to the sun's invasion. Speaking of the parking lot, talk about a place to settle one's differences. I saw more than a few scraps back there. Shit never escalated beyond the fist, though. More often than not, the two combatants would head in the back door of PC, through the groans of the patrons, to have a beer together. My friends and I would go there when we could, trying to outdo each other's scores in Bad Dudes, Xenophobe, and Pinbot. doing our best not to be too loud or we would catch the side-eye from Phil the bouncer. You'd hear a lot of talk in the back as the bar was in close proximity to the arcade games. Oftentimes it was sports banter. Sometimes it was about a particular VHS someone had rented next door at Logan Video. But every once in a while, it would pertain to those murders. Once I was a little older, it became a race with the clock for my friends and I, as we would try to fit in as many games as possible in between rest periods at the public pool, a block and a half up Mulberry. On one such occasion, I found myself playing the Pigskin 621 AD console, using my towel so as to not drip on the bar stool. Again, it was best not to piss off Phil. A couple of men were sitting at the far end of the bar near me. I wasn't paying attention until I heard the name Dale Johnston, followed by, "No way, it was just him. Would have taken at least 2 men. And the one would have had to have been stronger than that old man." The conversation went on as I continued to lose quarters. On our brisk walk to beat the lifeguard's whistle, signaling rest period's end, I was distracted by the conversation I had overheard. Even at my young age, I recognized bullshitting when I heard it. However, I had not until then imagined that more than one killer could have been involved. I crested the hill in the old Logan cemetery. Below me, kids stood in line for the high dive. Some sat along the pool's edge tossing soaked Nerf balls across the lanes. Others posed ready to cannonball and dive into the invitingly blue water. A couple of older kids were playing tennis on the courts in front of Keys Drives. No one here seemed to care about the murders. Sadly, I chose not to dwell on it too much myself. After all, I had swimming with friends and girls in swimsuits to distract me. Yet try as I might, I kept wondering, even for my own safety, what if whoever helped Dale was still out there? Was it that guy watching me behind the gravestone on the hill? This is Township Falls.
In the next episode, we will learn more about the renewed effort to find out who killed those kids all those years before. Special thanks to Nicole of the Columbus Metropolitan Library for supplying me with so many newspaper articles from their archives collection for this episode. And also thanks to my own live-in librarian, Adam, who found hundreds of articles for my viewing pleasure. You should follow along on Facebook, Insta, or TikTok to check out some of these. If you knew the victims or anyone involved in this case, please feel free to call into our recorded line at 419-777-1147 to share memories or opinions. Have a question that you want an answer to? Let us know and we will do our best to get that answer for you. Adam and I would like to take a minute to thank all of the people who have listened, shared, and subscribed, or talked about the podcast on social media.
From the Chew Boys in the 772 and the 561, to our friends and family in the 740, to our fans in the 419 to the 614, Alf, we love you, brother. Thanks for listening, and thanks for the love.
Music by Rich Ratbasky and Layman's Terms.